us through this Bible study that just can teach us a lesson today, more of what Uncle preached today, and help him go through this chapter, and hopefully get some good responses about what he's speaking about, and how interesting interesting stuff he's gonna be teaching us. Because that's all I got right now.
In Jesus' name.
In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you. All right. Job 31-32. That's what we're going to be going over this evening. And chapter 31, this whole chapter is occupied with Job's solemn oath of innocence. It was his final and explicit answer to the line of argument adopted by his three friends. So starting out, Job proclaims his innocence, and in 1-4, talked about how he was not guilty of lust. Job protested that he was a godly and blameless man, at least on a human scale. His larger context was to explain the sense of injustice he felt at his suffering and humiliation, and to make a final defense before his friends who accused him of special sin deserving of special judgment. This chapter has an interesting similarity, I think, to ancient defense documents when you look at them. In regard to the material is similar in form, if not in content, to the negative confession given by the deceased who stands before Osiris in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Under oath, the subject lists the evil things he has not done with the hope he will be vindicated and pass through the portals unscathed. And it is an oath of clearance in the form of a negative confession. So the procedure was well known in ancient jurisprudence. A crime could be disowned by calling down a curse on oneself if one had committed it. Yet it also has a clear connection to the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 31 in Job's Sermon on the Mount, for in it he touches on many of the same issues of spiritual ethics that Jesus covers in Matthew 5-7. Including the relationship between lust and adultery in Job 31:1, 9-12. Loving one's neighbor as oneself, Job 31:13-15. Almsgiving and social justice, which is Job 31:16-23. And the love of money and other idolatries, which is Job 31:24-28. We are clearly told in Job 1 that Job was a blameless and upright man. This is the chapter that most clearly explains what that godly life looked like. The chapter that we now open breathes a spirit that belongs rather to the new than to the old covenant. It's a practical anticipation of much of the teaching that was to come from Jesus, who sat down and taught his disciples on the mountain. It is the picture of one perfect and upright who feared God and eschewed evil. In defending his righteous life, Job began with explaining that he was a morally pure man who did not look upon a young woman in impure and inappropriate ways. It's significant that in this long section where Job explained his righteous life, he began with noting that he guarded his eyes from lustful looks upon a young woman. This rightly suggests that a man's ability to not look upon lustful images is an important indicator of his general righteousness and blamelessness. It also suggests that the eyes are a gateway for lust, especially for us men. This is demonstrated over and over again by empirical study. When a man places enticing, sensual, lust-inducing images before his eyes, it's a form of foreplay, especially considering that it often or frequently causes some level of sexual arousal in the man, if we're being 100% honest with ourselves.
Amen.
Job's ability to control himself was connected with a covenant he made. He made a vow, a promise, a commitment with his own eyes that he would not look upon a young woman in a sinful way. The Hebrew translation does not literally say that Job made a covenant with his eyes, quote, not made with, but the covenant here was made with God, against his eyes, which are regarded as an enemy likely to lead him astray. When Job says that he has made a covenant with his eyes to abstain from lust, he does not mean that he has stopped experiencing lust altogether, though. What he means is that he refuses to dwell upon the lustful feelings, which as normal red-blooded males, like he was, come to him very naturally. We know we are a sinful man, but Job insisted that he would not look upon a young woman, a maiden, in this way. This was especially meaningful because in that culture at that time, it would be somewhat accepted for a rich and powerful man like Job to seduce or ravish a maiden, and then add her as either a wife or a concubine. But Job restrained himself from women that others in his same circumstances probably would not have restrained themselves from. He restrained himself from the very thoughts and desires of filthiness with such persons, where most men allowed themselves to commit gross fornication as, deeming it to be either none or but a very little sin, is what they referred to it back then. Because that was just, when you were rich and powerful, you had all the, we know from, even with all the kings, all the concubines and wives, it was common practice. No big deal. So in the context of Job's self-control when it came to lust, he considered what the allotment of God from above was. He understood that the young woman he would be enticed to look upon was not the allotment of God for him. She and her nakedness did not belong to Job in any sense. And that's what helped him to keep his eyes focused on not being led astray by that. Leviticus 18:1-18 reinforces this biblical principle. It relates how the nakedness of an individual, quote, belongs to that individual and to their spouse. It does not belong to anyone else. Therefore, when one looks upon the nakedness of a woman or a man in today's society who's not his or her wife or husband, they take something that does not belong to them. There certainly existed some type of, going into it right now, some might get a little uncomfortable here, but there certainly existed some type of pornography in Job's day. Some of the earliest artistic images of women and men in highly sexualized motifs. Nevertheless, Job certainly did not have to contend with the sophisticated, gigantic, and far-reaching modern pornography industry we have today. The availability of modern pornography has made it a significantly greater challenge for us to confine our visual arousal to the allotment of God from above. In this context, it's helpful to ask whose nakedness belongs to me and who does not. It's simple as that. Only a proud and depraved person would think that every person's nakedness belongs to them, and vice versa. A moment of thought reinforces that clear principle that only the nakedness of his or her own wife or husband is the allotment of God from above, and only his own wife is the inheritance of the Almighty from on high for his visual arousal. The potential for destruction is all the more real in the modern world as well, because the challenges to biblical purity are all the more formidable. You're bombarded by it by everything nowadays. TV shows, music, anywhere you look, there's some form of sexuality in there. And we're even told and it's been out there for years, that the best marketing teams and companies out there, sex sells. That's what they've said. And they've proven it over and over again. Unfortunately. Using very rough estimates, we can compare the world of a man in the year AD 1500 to the world AD 2000. In 1500, the average age of a man's economic independence was 16, where today is 26. In 1500, the average age of marriage for a man was 18, where today it's 28 or more. In 1500, the average age of male puberty was 20, and you can get into what all has caused this. Today it's 12. So you got boys, literally boys, that are going through puberty. Versus back then, you were an adult before that happened. This means that there are many biological, cultural, economic, social, and technological factors that make it much more difficult for a man or woman today to make a covenant with their eyes to not look upon a young man or woman in the sense meant here by Job. It's much more difficult for us to choose satisfaction with the allotment of God from above and to avoid the destruction and disaster Job spoke of. Nevertheless, by the power of God's Spirit, it can be done. In verses 5 through 8, he talks about how he was not guilty of falsehood. He proclaimed his blameless life because he lived an essentially truthful life. He was not afraid to be weighed on honest scales and have his life examined in an honest way. That's where you get the old term, weighed and measured. They were talking about their life and how they lived is to be weighed. Your character, how you lived. Job was not afraid to call a curse upon himself. If he indeed was not an honest man, he was willing to be deprived of the fruit of his own labor. It was true that he was found lacking on the honest scales of God's judgment, though. The confidence Job had in calling curses upon himself, if he were not truthful, it is impressive. You have to give it to him. And it said, it's as if he was saying to his friends, do you think that I am trying to make out before God that I am what I have not been? Would I talk to God with what would be blatant insolence if I had not the facts to back me up? It's kind of like, he was telling his friends, y'all really think that I would be this bold and this claiming all this if I didn't have the facts to back me up? Now, at the same time, you'll see here in a little bit, the way that he went about it in this chapter was a little too self-indulgent. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But, you got to give him credit. He never did back down. In 9 through 12, he talked about how he was not an adulterer. The next area of integrity Job proclaimed had to do with faithfulness to his wife within the marriage. He understood that this had more than a sexual aspect, perhaps first mentioned in Job 31, 1 through 4, but also included in the heart being enticed. See, Job touched upon a significant truth that's entirely possible. It's entirely possible to allow one's heart to be enticed by another. These things happen because of choices one makes, not merely because one has been acted upon by the mystical or magical power of, quote, romantic love. Instead, Job insisted that for him to have his heart enticed by another would be wickedness. And indeed, it would be iniquity deserving of judgment. He understood that he had control over whom he would allow his heart to be enticed by. And I think that that's important because over the decades and the periods, we right there have kind of sidestepped that to the point where we even say, and it's been a phrase, you can't help who you fall in love with. Well, if you're truly in love with the person that God sent you, then like Job said, you do have control over whom your heart is enticed by. Because you shouldn't be enticed by anyone else. So we've kind of sidestepped taking on that responsibility that's truly ours, as Job, showed here. And he insisted that if he had been unfaithful in heart or in action towards his wife, that he would deserve to have his wife taken from him and given to another. Now, we'll get why that's important here in a second, because he's conscious of his own innocence, that so much so that he's willing it should be put to the utmost proof. And if he's found guilty, that he may be exposed to the most distressing and humiliating punishment of that day, even to that of being deprived of his goods, bereaved of his children, and his wife made a slave. That's what he meant when he said given to another. It wasn't like she was going and happily being married with someone else. No, he was stating, if I'm found guilty, take my wife and make her someone else's slave. Now that's a bold statement right there. Especially when his wife done, as we saw already, we don't know 100%, but she was either, are you sure you just don't want to, curse him and go? Like, you're going to be good, instead of going through all this pain. And then if she's there to hear him say this, then all of a sudden, to her, it might seem like he's throwing her under the bus. Because everybody thinks he's guilty, including, from what we have understanding of, his wife. So if you're the spouse, and your husband or wife says, no, hey, look, if I'm found guilty, y'all go ahead and make them a slave. What type of way you gonna feel? But he was so bold and like I said, conscious of his own innocence, that he was like, yeah, go ahead. Take all my stuff, take my children, and make my wife a slave. And subject it to all indignities in that state is what I'll take on if I'm found guilty. So he's pretty much saying, now what you got? Because I know I'm innocent. There's no way you're going to find me guilty. In this, we can see that Job was tempted to adultery, but resisted the temptation. He said the devil's fire fell upon wet tinder, and if he knocked at Job's door, there was nobody at home to look out at the window and let him in, for he considered the punishment both human. That was Job 31:11, and divine, which is Job 31:12, due to this great wickedness. So 13 through 15, it talks about now how he didn't treat his servants cruelly. So you see, we're going from, I haven't looked at anybody the wrong way, in a lustful way. I haven't even given my heart to anyone but my wife. I've been straightforward, 100% committed to my wife, and that's it. And now we're getting into, and I'm even treating my servants good. So he's, in this whole chapter, he's laying out why, like all his good deeds of what I've done, how I've lived my life. This is why I'm not guilty, because I've done all this. So, like I said, 13 through 15, he continued the presentation of his own righteousness by noting the good and compassionate treatment of his servants. The goodness of a man or woman is often best indicated by how they treat those thought to be inferior to them, not how they treat their peers or those thought to be superior to them. And that goes back to another old saying, as far as, true serving is when you do something for someone that you know can't repay you. Because you're serving out of the goodness of your heart. It's not about, well, if I help them out here, I know they're going to turn it over twofold over here. Gonna come. No, it's not about that. One reason Job treated his servants well was because he understood that he would have to answer to God for his actions towards others, including his servants. And that goes back to, where we've read before, that we are responsible for our brother's actions. So he knew that he was going to be responsible towards his actions as well. He understood God cared about his servants and would avenge ill treatment of them. Another reason Job treated his servants well was because he recognized their essential humanity. That was both remarkable and admirable in a time when it was almost universally understood that servants and slaves were subhuman next to those whom they served. So not only did he know that God would, not be happy if he didn't treat them, but he was one of the few back in that time period. Like it says, it was remarkable and admirable because it was almost universally understood that servants and slaves were subhuman next to those whom they served. So now no one even considered their slaves human for the most part. You my dog. Go do what I told you to do. And here he was treating them with kindness. In 16 through 23, he did not victimize the poor or the weak either. As a further testimony to his righteousness, Job insisted that he had been good and kind to the poor and to the helpless, such as the widow and the fatherless. In the same manner as before, Job called for a curse upon himself if it was true that he had not cared for the poor and helpless as he claimed he had. He knew that if he had been cruel and oppressive to the poor and needy, that he would indeed deserve punishment, and this was part of his motivation to care the way that he did. Again, another area where he's like, hey, if this ain't what happened, I call a curse upon myself. You don't understand, when people called curses upon themselves back in that day, that was, I don't even know what we could equate it to today, because that was basically, that'd be like saying today, I'm telling you that, I swear it on my mama's life. That would be like, I'm drawing a curse down upon myself. Like, if you tell someone you swear it on your mom's life, or whatever family member, this or that, unless you straight wicked, that's like the no doubt, no question. All right, I believe you, man. Like, if you're gonna say that, I believe you. And that's how it was when you call curses down upon yourself. Like, if I'm lying, I call this curse down upon myself. Like, no, this is end all be all, no joke. This is what I'm telling you, the truth. 24 through 28, he was not greedy or a seeker of false gods. Job knew that wealthy men often found it easy to trust in riches. Therefore, he again insisted that he had not made riches his hope or his confidence, and also had not rejoiced because his wealth was great. Job meant that he had not engaged in the common practice of sun worship back then. His heart was not secretly enticed to idolatry, which was apparently sometimes worshipped with the kissing of the hand. Now this is pretty, I think, a little significant in today's time. See, when the idols were out of reach of the idolaters, where they could not kiss them, they used to kiss their hands, and as it were, to throw kisses at them, of which we have many examples in heathen writers. Now think about this. When you see, I'm just going to leave it at this, but when you see some religions kissing the rings of higher members, where did that originate from? Well, we're told right here. That was from idolaters. Just leave it at that and keep on moving. 29 through 34. He was generally without blame. As further testimony to his personal righteousness, he claimed that he had not been happy when his enemies had suffered and been destroyed. This is certainly one mark of a man after God's heart, who also takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked, according to Ezekiel 33 and 11. Now think about that. How many of us today, in all honesty, you always got that one or two people that they just, man, they've been bugging you forever. They just rude, whatever it is. And how many of us could honestly 100% say that if something happened to them, you wouldn't feel, maybe not be happy, but you wouldn't feel like a little relieved. Yet here he's like, I take no happiness in the enemies that suffered or destroyed. Like, I'm sad. You sad that your enemies were taken out? Like, who thinks that way? Most of us would be like, man, I'm glad that that's out of my life. You know what I mean? And the thing is, Job didn't even curse his enemies. He kept himself from this most natural reaction. Didn't even curse them. Job was also a diligent man when it came to hospitality. He would not allow a visitor to sleep on the street, and instead he opened his doors to the traveler. How many of us in today's society would do that? If we just saw someone literally outside of our house on the street, never seen them before, don't know who they are, hey man, hey sir, why don't you come on into this warm place? You don't need to be out there and sleep. How many of us would do that today? Not a lot. Now, there's all kinds of reasons and excuses that we could make. Well, today's world's different and all that. Yeah, you're all right. But if you truly walk in the path of Jesus Christ and putting all your faith and everything into him, should those thoughts even cross your mind? Or is that maybe Jesus as one of your opportunities when he came knocking at the door that you turned him away? Because if you truly believe, you know that he's going to work all things out for your good and he's going to protect you. So if someone that shows up outside your house one day, all I'm saying is, the Spirit will lead you, but it may not be something that, oh man, I feel bad for him, I'll pray for him and go on in your house. Just go talk to him. Let the Spirit discern if it's a good or a wicked person. And if it's good, do what God says. Invite him in. I ain't saying that you necessarily got have him sleep with you, but hey, you need some water, invite him in, why don't you come rest? Because again, it's all about what would Jesus do? Well, we know what Jesus would do. The basic and consistent argument of Job's friends against him was that though he, quote, appeared to be righteous, he really must be covering some serious sin that made sense of the calamity that came against him. Therefore, Job insisted that he was not covering his sins as Adam, who blamed Eve and vainly tried to cover his sin. Here, Job answered the accusation that he was motivated to hide his sin because of the fear of how it would appear before the public. Job's friends had probably known many seemingly righteous people who had hidden their sins and were destroyed when they were eventually exposed, and they assumed Job was like them. Job here rightly protested that he was not like such men who hide their sin out of fear or public humiliation and contempt. Now, starting 35 through 37, now we're getting into when Job concludes his plea. Job demands an audience with God in 35 through 37. It seems that Job interrupted his defense of the morality and righteousness of his life. He probably had much more he could say to defend himself, but broke off that line of reasoning and made a final dramatic appeal to be heard before the throne of God. The finality of his words are demonstrated by the phrase, quote, "Here is my mark." See, back then, Job's statement means literally, "Here is my taw." Some versions translate this as, "Here's my signature." And since taw, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, could be used like our letter X to denote a person's mark or signature. Yet even more interesting is the fact that in the ancient Hebrew script used by the author of Job, this letter taw was a cross-shaped mark. In a sense, therefore, what Job was saying is, quote, "Here is my cross." Which I thought that was very interesting when I got into researching all that. Job was absolutely convinced that what he needed was vindication, or at least the answer from God. His friends thoroughly analyzed his situation and came to completely wrong conclusions. Job couldn't make sense of it himself. Here he called God out to answer for what he had done. This shows the profound yet understandable spiritual confusion of Job. He felt that God was his accuser, my prosecutor, when really we know it was Satan. We sympathize with Job knowing that he could not see behind that mysterious curtain that separated earth from heaven, yet we learn from what Job should have known. Here Job, stepping over bound he would later repent of, longed to have the accusation of God against him written out so he could refute it as he had so effectively refuted his friends. He was so confident in what he knew of himself that he said he would, quote, "approach God like a prince." So in 38 through 40, the conclusion of Job's words. In this chapter, Job testified to his own integrity in the most solemn of terms, calling repeated curses upon himself if his friends could indeed demonstrate that he was a conspicuous sinner, worthy of conspicuous judgment or discipline from God. Now he called one more witness on his behalf, his own land and property. It isn't that there are no more words from Job in this book of Job, obviously. He'll speak again briefly in later chapters. Yet Job is definitely done, quote, arguing his case. He's finished. One more man will try in vain to fix the problem, and then God will appear. We might rightly say that God, silent to this point, could not or would not appear and speak until all the arguments of man were exhausted. At this point, then, we have reached the end of Job's expression of pain. The end is silence. That is God's opportunity for speech. He often waits until we have said everything, and then in the silence, prepared for such speech, is when he chooses to answer. So when you're going through something, instead of always trying to prove your case, if someone says something bad about you, or if you don't understand why you're going through what you're going through, instead of trying, like I said, to prove your case and talk it out and all that, sometimes just stay quiet and let God handle it from the start. So that's chapter 31. So before we move on to 32, we got any questions, comments? You good?
Yeah.
You good? Pastor, you good? You don't have anything to add?
No.
Okay.
It's not
I
that.
told you it was going deep today. All right. Chapter 32. Chapter 32 is a little shorter. In 1 through 5, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong. Elihu? How would you say it?
I said Elihu, but I've heard others say it.
Okay, Elihu and his dissatisfaction with the answers of Job's friends is what 1 through 5 is about. At the end of Job's persuasive arguments in Job 28 through 30, his friends had nothing more to say. They still thought that Job was completely wrong, but they felt he was so confirmed in his own opinions, meaning he was righteous in his own eyes, that it was useless to keep the discussion going. All of the friends of Job, Elihu is the only one with a genealogy, which I thought that was kind of interesting as well. He is called, Elihu he is called, the name is Hebrew, and its signification is my God is he. Now, he appears and disappears suddenly, yet he does belong, and his speech makes sense here. It's true that he is not mentioned elsewhere in the book, so his speech is, I guess you could say, could be left out, but at the beginning of Job 32 and at the end of Job 37, they are skillfully woven into the fabric of the book and made to play a legitimate role. Apparently, he was a silent listener at the whole dialogue up to this point. He was angry against Job because he felt that Job justified himself rather than God. And he felt that Job was more concerned about being right himself than God being right. And that's where I was saying, Job, yeah, he was laying it out, but it was all about me and my righteousness. Like he said, it wasn't about God. Not yet, but like we know later on, he repented. Elihu was also angry at Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar because they had failed to solve the controversy. They had found no answer. While at the same time, they were, in his opinion, too harsh against Job, and yet had condemned Job. Out of respect for those older than he had held back for as long as he felt he could. Now he felt that he simply had to speak. In chapters 6 through 9, he overcame his hesitancy to speak. So he came as a young man among older men, and because of this, was willing to hold his words for a long time. See, back then, you really also had a very strict system when it came to knowing your place, so to speak, within age groups. You respected the elders. The elders were the ones that had the final end say before the young ones ever said anything. And so that's what he was. I sat back, respecting the old elders for as long as I could. Now I gotta say something. And he believed that just because Job and his 3 friends were older, that it did not mean they were the only ones with a spirit in a man. Meaning they weren't the only ones that had the spirit inside of them, just because they were older. And the only one who had received understanding from the Almighty. So that whole, as you're older, you're wiser, he was saying that ain't necessarily true in the spirit form. Not talking about in the manly world form, but he's talking about purely in the spiritual form. We can only imagine the reaction from Job and his 3 friends at these words of Elihu. They were probably united together for the first time in a long time. They might not agree with each other, but they certainly would disagree that this young upstart could be wiser or have more understanding than they did. Now we get into where he introduces his speech, starting with 10 through 14. He criticizes Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar as ineffective. From this request for the attention and ear of Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, we can assume that there were sour and disdainful faces on the older men. Yet, Elihu pressed forward, asking for this audience. He was frustrated because Job's friends didn't put him in his place the way he thought they should. We can also imagine following the debate, thinking of what he would say in response to Job, and being frustrated that the answers of Job's friends were not as brilliant as the answers of his own in his mind. 15 through 22, this is his inner compulsion to speak. He noted that Job's friends were exhausted by the debate. In his mind, it was fortunate that he had so much energy and so many words, because now he could start where the 3 friends had left off. For I am full of words, the spirit within me compels me. He certainly was full of words, literally. For this and the next 5 chapters, he will drone on and on, unable to shut up, and unable to let anyone else speak. I found this interesting when doing my research as well. It is by far the longest single speech in the book of Job, longer than even God's speech in later chapters. So that should tell you how much he was just vibing on. Now, he was determined to flatter no man except himself. And in this obviously self-flattering introduction to the speech, he's clearly presented himself as smarter, wiser, and having more understanding than any of the 4 other men with him. He seemed painfully unaware of how he sounded and looked. And that's, we don't get to get into all his juicy, long talk about himself, because that's the next chapter. So that's, I told you 32 would be quicker. But any questions, comments on 32? Pastor, you got anything to add?
No, not really. We could talk about what goes on next, but we'll talk about that next week.
Right, when we get to it, yeah.
Set it up.
Yeah, 32 kind of just,
Yeah.
breaks off right before he gets into it.
It could have just started with 33, you know what I mean?
Yep.
As opposed to introducing 33, but.
Yep. Alrighty. Well, we're done, and that's 31 and 32.
Amen.
Well, we'll go ahead and pray us out, and we all go ahead and make it home safely, Lord willing.
I'll go through this one. Oh, okay, my bad.
Oh,
I know
what?
you're doing it this time. You go ahead.
Oh, did you want to do this one?
Oh, no, I didn't know you was gonna do it. I was gonna say something.
Oh, gotcha, okay. So, I thought you was like, no, I don't want to do it again. So, no, Lord, we come to you this evening thanking you for the safe travels here. We thank you for the word that you gave me for the study, and pray that you use it for the embetterment of all of us maturing in the Spirit, and continue to watch over, bless us for all those that are sick and not feeling well. We pray for safe travels home. We give you thanks for just another day here. And we pray that you will, if it's your will, you will continue to give us more days on this earth to do your will. And we give thanks and praise all this in your son's name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.